Welcome to the third week of our study in the book of Revelation that we're calling Rediscovering Jesus through Revelation. And today we're going to look at who Jesus is, in fact, who John describes Jesus as, which I think is fascinating at the end of chapter 1. And then as we even go into chapters 2 and 3, how Jesus describes himself. And then we're going to spend some time digging into the context of the 7 churches in Asia Minor, and ultimately conclude today with talking about the occasion of the letter. Why was it that the occasion of the book, why was it that this book was written? What's the point of it? And so again, as I have been the past couple of weeks, I'm joined by 2 good friends, Dr. David D. Feiser and Dr. Donald Patrick Harris. Welcome, guys, to this study again.
Thank you. It's good to be back together.
It's always great to be here.
Well, we're going to begin with John's Jesus. And that's an odd way to talk about it, but John paints this portrait of Jesus that is unique in all of the New Testament. And I think that's significant as we dig into trying to understand who Jesus is in the book of Revelation. Guys, Revelation chapter 1, beginning around verse 12, John begins to have this encounter with a voice. He says, then he turned and I see the voice that was speaking to me, and on turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash around his chest. And then he goes on to this really marvelous, fantastic description of Jesus. What do you all make of that?
Well, this image of Jesus is in many ways unlike anything we see in the Gospels. In some ways, we might even say unique in the whole of the Bible. And what I mean by that is it could be argued there are places in the Old Testament even where we get to see the pre-incarnate Christ. And for whatever reason, what comes to my mind is the one who is like a son of the gods that is seen in the furnace with the 3 Hebrew children, that is unlike any person ever seen. And then, of course, I think, again, the closest thing we come to this image of Jesus in Revelation is Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, where he is, the Greek word says metamorphosed into this incredible image where he's the imagery, the wording that John uses makes it almost sound like Jesus's face is giving off light as much as his clothes. So there's nothing like John's image of Jesus in the rest of Scripture.
And that's neat, isn't it? It draws my attention to Paul's beautiful Christological passage in Philippians 2, when he talks about the form, that Jesus takes the form of a human, the form of a servant. And you almost get this idea that, as you refer to in the Old Testament, that there was a form of Christ in the Old Testament. And then here in Revelation, it seems as if we're seeing a form of Jesus that John is portraying here. Don, do you have some thoughts?
My thoughts went to Daniel 7 and his vision of the Ancient of Days. And it reads like this: as I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat, whereas in Revelation, he's already seated. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. and it goes on through verse 10, but that is what came to my mind initially.
Well, one of the interesting things about Revelation chapter 1 and John's description of Jesus is that we meet this description again in each of the 7 letters to the 7 churches. It's as if Jesus is reaffirming John's vision that this is, in fact, Jesus who is writing to these churches. Now, I love, of course, John's response here in chapter 1, because I mean, and to think about this in the entire context of John's relationship with Jesus. I mean, he was with Jesus for 3 years, the beloved disciple. He's the one that's on the breast of Christ at the supper. He's the one who's given care of Jesus's mother. You just have this picture that besides him being called the son of thunder, that there is a special relationship between Jesus and John. Not necessarily unique, but certainly special. And then when we come to Revelation chapter 1, when John encounters the resurrected, ascended, and seated Christ, he is in awe of what he sees. And he records that he fell down as if dead. Boy, what an amazing experience that must have been.
When we consider the fact that the typical human reaction to seeing an angel or a heavenly being up close and personal is to fall over as if dead, to in the words of Isaiah, to declare, "Woe is me." How much more so seeing the resurrected, ascended, dare I say it, victorious Christ up close and personal, to know he's speaking to you and calling you to do something. That I don't think we can truly appreciate what that must have been like for John. Even though this was just a vision, it must have been very palpable.
And then the text in chapter 1 records that Jesus laid his right hand on me, saying, "Fear not, I am the first and the last." And I mean, I just love that image there of Jesus stretching out his hand to John and telling him to fear not. It must have reminded him of his experience with Jesus, that he is the great I am, that he has called us not to fear. That we should absolutely be in awe of Jesus, but to know that he is with us and that he reaches out to touch us brings us great comfort, as it did John in this account.
It seems as though John didn't recognize who he was. It was so glorious that he had to be told. And even though he knew Jesus intimately, in this setting, he's just really overwhelmed.
And the way that Jesus tells John, it's verbal, but it's also physical. He lays his hand on him, and he says to John, and I don't know what about that, but it just seems really cool to think of Jesus stretching out his hand and speaking to John. And it was then that John recognizes who Jesus is.
I think there's something to that, though. I mean, yes, this is a vision, but it speaks to how God interacts with the whole of who we are. Our relationship with the Lord is not merely a spiritual relationship, like the Gnostics and a lot of contemporary New Age type beliefs view. In fact, that he would reach out and touch John is very reminiscent of how he would minister to people during his earthly ministry. human touch is an incredible, affectionate way to communicate to someone. And, as we'll see as we get deeper and deeper into Revelation, the judgments are very physical. It's not merely a spiritual judgment that Christ will bring. The judgments begin well before Christ returns. And here we're seeing just the opposite, a reaching out and physically putting the hand on John as a sign of reassurance, as a sign, don't fear. I am he who is the first and the last. What a powerful way to be raised back up to your feet or something. I mean, didn't necessarily dispel the awe, but it certainly reassured him on some level.
Absolutely. Yeah. And such a reassurance, not only for John, but for the churches too. As I mentioned earlier, when Jesus introduces himself, he writes these 7 letters to the 7 churches. And in each letter, it begins with a description of who he is. So, for example, in chapter 2, verse 1, to the church in Ephesus, he says that the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand and who walks among the 7 golden lampstands. He's drawing out of that description, that picture, that vision that John has just seen of Jesus, and saying that this is who I am. That same Jesus that John is fearful of, in awe of, the same Jesus who reached out and laid his hand on John and told him not to fear, is the Jesus that is walking alongside of you, the church, and bringing you this really very pastoral epistle. I just think that the church must have sensed a great relief, perhaps in one sense, but a great sense of promise too, that Jesus is the one who said that he would build his church, and he's holding true to that promise. So as we get into the 7 churches, let's talk a bit about their situation as we read through this. And we've had some interaction on this during the course of the day today together. But what are some of the key points that you guys see that these 7 churches are dealing with in their context of Asia Minor?
One of the first things to remember is that each of these churches has a place before the Lord in his heavenly throne room. That, I think, is an easy detail to kind of read past because it kind of happens early on in that second or first chapter. But the fact that they are there in his presence is, in a sense, what precipitates his concern, his care, and his frustration with at least 5 of the 7 churches.
Yeah, a great point. I mean, so John says that this one that he hears the voice of is the one that's walking among these lampstands. That Christ is very present with his church. What a beautiful picture. I think, too, it's important for us to keep in mind that here is where we see the epistolary nature of Revelation, isn't it? These very much are letters addressed to specific churches, written by a specific person. And so we see this epistolary nature as well.
I did read something this morning that really challenged my thinking in this area. Of course, we've talked about genre, the epistolary, the prophetic, and the apocalyptic. And the person I was reading is named J. Ramsey Michaels, and he wrote a book entitled Interpreting the Book of Revelation. And he wants to come out very strongly and say that you pretty much have to recognize all 3 genres, but you also need to be careful when you look at epistolary literature, because he says it sounds strange to have letters within a letter. And my tendency before this discussion was to sort of cut it up and say, well, here's the epistolary section, here's the prophetic section, here's the apocalyptic section. And so he would say it is an epistolary, it is a letter written in a prophetic style with apocalyptic elements. Now, is that saying something different, or is that more of the same? But with his thesis, with that being his position, he said, I think it would be better to look at these so-called letters to the seven churches as oracles, similar to what the prophets wrote when they spoke of the nations, or when they spoke specifically to Israel and Judah, to say this is an oracle to Ephesus, for example, Smyrna, Pergamum, etc. And so, yes, they're letters, but I was challenged to reconsider whether or not these are 7 letters within a letter, or whether this is an open letter to all and everyone else gets to read the other's mail. I mean, can you imagine the joy and delight at that?
I think that's my answer to your question is yes. I think there's elements of both to that. And I appreciate you bringing that up, because it reminds me that while these letters are so short and they only make up the 2nd and 3rd chapter, we really need to read the rest of Revelation with these 7 letters in mind. Because it's not like, okay, it was just this little paragraph that Jesus meant for this one church and we can forget about them. Everything that comes after these letters is meant for these 7 churches.
Right.
And by extension, the rest of the church, really. But we really need to use these 7 churches as kind of a lens through which to read the whole book. So in a sense, there are these 7 letters that are written within the letter, but at the same time, everything that comes thereafter is absolutely critical to help these 7 churches follow Christ, and for those, in the case of Ephesus, to regain their first love, to know that love will be rewarded in the end.
I would say just a strong affirmation to this concept that the church, or the revelation, this letter, is written to historical churches, real people who lived in time, space, and history. Mm-hmm. And the rest of the book must mean as much to them as these letters mean to them. It's how he's addressing the issues that they're facing, both their failures and their shining moments as well.
Good. So in other words, and this is something that we keep repeating, that the book of Revelation cannot mean to us what it did not mean to them.
Yes, absolutely. And I think if there's a fatal flaw in much that passes for contemporary interpretation, is that it kind of takes Revelation up like a ball and runs with it in any sort of direction. And I can't imagine that the first readers, the first recipients, the first hearers of this letter being read would have any recognition of some of what passes for contemporary interpretation. I mean, some of it's right out of science fiction, fantasy type stuff. And I think these 7 churches should serve for the contemporary reader, whatever time period the reader is coming from. They are our anchor at this. While it was not purely for them in its entirety in terms of the meaning of it, we're not talking a preterist interpretation, but it has to have a meaning that is particular to their time, but also has universal meaning for every generation of the church to come thereafter. And they are our anchor. I think they keep us honest in our interpretation. Otherwise, we're going to come up with interpretations that leave them in the dust. Mm-hmm. And that would, in my humble opinion, be doing violence to both the text and to God's intent to that first generation of believers.
So, David, would you see then, as we look at these 7 churches, that we might fully expect to see something about ourselves in these churches, something that's going to help us to understand how we are to move forward as we face challenging times?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so on the one hand, we're saying that revelation can't mean to us what it would never have meant to those believers receiving it. But at the same time, there is that universal message. And like Don, I don't want to say too much that gets ahead of where we are today, but, as maybe a little primer for that, it is a word of hope and warning for the church in every generation. And, we need to read Revelation soberly. I think Don has said before, we need to put the newspaper down and stop trying to find Revelation's fulfillment in contemporary events. However, we also need to read it with an eye towards perhaps the mirror, as it were, looking at ourselves through the lens of Revelation and humbling ourselves. Have I forgotten my first love? Am I compromising my faith in some way, shape, or form for the sake of achievement or comfort in this life? The statements that the Lord makes to 5 of the 7 churches, at least, really should catch our attention, such that we are prayerfully asking the Lord, much like David in the Psalms, Lord, reveal to me my heart, show me my heart, and cleanse me of any unrighteousness, so that we can return to our first love.
If I may, I would like to rephrase our thesis, Michael, that you stated. It's just slightly different, but I think it brings it out a little bit stronger, that our interpretation of Revelation cannot possibly be what it could not have meant to them. And the key phrase there, or the key word, is could not. In an earlier podcast, I had mentioned that I may not know everything that the Revelation teaches. That is, I may not have the correct interpretation on everything, but I'm quite sure I know many things that it does not teach, right? So I don't know if you remember that comment, but I think it ties in that it cannot possibly mean for us what it could not have meant for them. And this gets into some of the wild speculation of who are these locusts and who are these various manifestations of dragons and so on. And in my time and in the course of my life, I have heard so many things that are just way off the wall. I mean, they're beyond science fiction. They're just off the wall. So we can take some of those things out of the mix, and we can say, well, we know it doesn't mean that. And so if we're, as David said, reading the Revelation through the newspaper, then we want to be very careful, because that might be one of those things that it could not have meant to the first century audience.
Good. Well, let's dive a little bit more deeply into these 7 churches and look at some of the things that Jesus talks about with them in regards to what we might be able to discern related to the cultural circumstances that they're facing. some of the things are familiar to us because they're not the first time we encounter some of these issues. For example, to the church in Ephesus, that Jesus is commending them for their stance against false apostles. That this is perhaps a perennial issue in the early church, as it is even for our day. We continue to be confronted with those who would falsely proclaim who Christ is. What are, and then there are some issues here that are a little strange to us. For example, the Nicolaitans. Who are these guys or gals, or what's a Nicolaitan? We don't know much about this group of people. In fact, what we do know about them comes from Irenaeus when he writes in the late second century. He mentions this group of Nicolaitans, and he relates them to the deacon, presumed deacon, might not have been a deacon, but certainly a servant in the church in Acts chapter 6 by the name Nicholas. And as the tradition at least arrives to Irenaeus, Nicholas, to demonstrate his commitment, fidelity, if you will, to Christ, he began to envision an aspect of that fidelity being abstinence, and to again demonstrate his commitment to the Lord, he gave his wife to other men to have sexual relations with, so that he would not have those relations. And that grew into this sect or cult that became known as the Nicolaitans. It's interesting, again, as we're dealing with these seven churches, to remember that Jesus is going to draw imagery that's going to be familiar to the churches, but it might not be an exact image of what's happening in those churches. And so with the Nicolaitans, for example, we virtually know nothing about them. There's no indication that the Nicolaitans ever reached Asia Minor. But what we do know is that there was a practice of sexually exploiting women in Asia Minor that was all over Asia Minor. And so it seems, as we confront the Nicolaitans in the church in Ephesus and then again in the church in Pergamum, that what it is that Jesus is addressing is the practice of exploiting women for sexual favors. And he's calling the church to not do that. And of course, he's commending the church in Ephesus that they stood against the work of the Nicolaitans.
Well, my observation is not nearly as titillating as that one. So I'll look at etymology. Okay. And I'll say, Boyd, Michael, your story there, it gets people to lean in and listen very hard. But I would say that looking at the etymology, Nikos, of course, is the word for overcomer, and Nike Shoes has done a good job of branding that. At least their name, Nike, comes from, it's in the same family of words. But I'm thinking of how the churches wrestled with internal problems, and some of those internal problems definitely had to do with false teaching, and the false teaching was often promulgated by people who wanted to have the power or the preeminence in the church. And so when I read Nicolaitans, I'm thinking of people who love to have the power, people who want to have the dominance over other people. Now, this will speak to pastors for sure, because most pastors would agree that there's a church boss in every congregation. And yet I don't think that's what this is speaking to necessarily. I do think it is speaking more than likely to false teachers who wanted to have authority in the church. So was this an organized group? Is it like the one Irenaeus has spoken of that Michael related to us? Is this something that generally happens in churches, and churches have to fight from within? And we know that eventually at least some of these churches are going to have to fight with circumstances without. But that's where I would come down on this question.
I think those are solid insights. It does remind me of what Donald was saying earlier about what we can't necessarily know. Revelation doesn't give us enough in and of itself, so we do have to appeal to later generations like Irenaeus to give us some insight. But it is, in a sense, particularly to our contemporary evangelical ears, a little eerie that all the things that Jesus commends them for, we uphold as values, right? So what I'm getting at is he says your toil, your patient endurance, you cannot bear with those who are evil. You have tested those who call themselves apostles but are found to be false. You're enduring patiently and bearing up for my name's sake, and you have not grown weary. But I have this against you. You've abandoned the love you had at first. And it's a good reminder that even our opposition to the Nicolaitans or other false teachers is insufficient if we are not, if that's not somehow being motivated by love, whether it's love for our Lord and Savior or love for those who are threatened by such false teachers, or even as Jesus said himself, our love for our enemies, because it's not our place to judge our enemies, but to turn them over to the Lord for him to do with as he would. These are really sobering words. I almost wonder if we need to recite them to ourselves every night we go to bed and when we get up in the morning. Gotta love, gotta love, gotta love. Help me, Lord.
Certainly two viewpoints on the Nicolaitans, for sure. And I'm sure there are many others who have various viewpoints. What's compelling to me in regards to Irenaeus's insight into who these were is that we know that this was a cultural practice in the city of Ephesus to exploit women sexually. It wasn't temple prostitution. That's not what they're talking about. But what was going on in Ephesus was the practice of the courtesans who would go in and entertain men in the bath or in the spa, and would teach them. Actually, these men would become fascinated with their teaching. We have ancient records of these kinds of conversations that women or the men would say that these women are more fascinating and intelligent than Socrates, for example. And so there was a real desire on the part of men to be entertained by these women. And often the descriptions that we have of these courtesans would be that they would dress scantily. Often they would exchange sexual favors and would entertain these men. I've put forward in a different place that this was the issue that Paul was addressing in 1 Timothy chapter 2 with his instructions for women to not teach. This was something that was happening in the culture. So those kinds of things, when I think about a text meaning first what it meant to them before it could mean something for us, I have to look at those kinds of cultural things that are going on that we know about. Not necessarily from Scripture itself, but from other sources that are contemporary with Scripture. And so we have well-documented sources of the practices of the courtesans in the city of Ephesus and in Asia Minor in general. Don, other thoughts on the Nicolaitans that you'd like to share?
Maybe just a couple, and I'll try to keep it brief. Would the identification of those in verse 2 who call themselves apostles and are not, and found to be false, would this be the same group who are the Nicolaitans? I think a case can be made for that. I don't know if they're separate or the same, but that's probably the direction I would go. And in my reading, I didn't do this as though I was going to preach on it and need to explain every single element of every verse. The second thing is, yes, it's very interesting to hear about the courtesans and what was happening there culturally in Asia Minor. My question would be, is that what was happening in the church here at Ephesus? Now, you've made that connection in some of your prior study and writing, but I don't know if that's the case, that it was going on inside the church. Obviously, something was happening in Ephesus that would cause Paul to issue a prohibition of some sort and to bring that to an end. So maybe we see Paul and John here tag teaming, so to speak, on this subject, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, what I love about this letter from Jesus to the church in Ephesus is that it demonstrates that the church was in many ways successful. It stood against the false apostles, and Jesus commends them for it. They stood against the work of the Nicolaitans, or those practices that were similar to the Nicolaitans.
Right.
And they were successful at standing against that, and Jesus commends them. But as David alluded to, the one thing that he had against them was that they abandoned, and this is interesting, they abandoned the works. They abandoned the works of their first love. They didn't abandon their first love. They abandoned the works of their first love. And I find that interesting as well.
Right. And just one other note here in verse 7, and he does this with each of the churches by concluding and saying, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches, plural.
Mm.
So this is not, yes, it is a message for Ephesus. I'm certainly not denying that. But again, this gets to this circular letter idea that he wants everyone to learn from what's happened, both good, bad, and ugly, in each individual church.
Mm-hmm. Great insight. One of the other interesting cultural issues that we confront in these churches, we find in the city of Smyrna. We meet this church who is struggling in poverty. Jesus says that they're being in some way slandered by the people who falsely call themselves Jews. And then he makes mention of this interesting location, perhaps, a place called the Synagogue of Satan. Let's hear your thoughts on the Synagogue of Satan.
Well, is it a one-size-fits-all answer? I don't know. But in one sense, it could refer to the synagogue that was there in Smyrna, where the church was they were persecuting the church there. Again, I don't know that dating necessarily impacts that or not, but it could also be kind of a metaphor for a group that just was, I guess we would view them as somewhat satanic, a pagan group that was vehemently opposed to the church. But the fact that we read in verse 9 there that there's this connection, those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan, I think lends itself to the reading that this was a local synagogue or a local group of Jewish folk who were actively involved in the church's persecution. Whether they were trying to ingratiate themselves to the local Roman authorities or were taking it on themselves to try to shut down that local church or group of house churches, we don't have enough in the text itself but I think that's a reasonable.
Hmm. Yeah, good. Well, here I came across a book recently. Actually, they talk about it as a source book for synagogues in up to the year 200. And as near as they can tell, they try to document all of the sources that make reference to a synagogue in the Roman Empire. And there are two references there are several references, of course, to the seven churches, but two of them are really striking because the church or the synagogue, or I should say, the city of Smyrna only has one historical reference to synagogue in all of the literature. There's no archaeological evidence, and there's no inscriptions about a synagogue in the city of Smyrna, except for what is written here in the book of Revelation. It's the only place that we have any acknowledgement of the use of the word synagogue in relationship to Smyrna. And I found that very interesting.
I think, not to be melodramatic or anything, but one might wonder if it was given the epithet of synagogue of Satan, if God removed that place, short of archaeological digging, their memory has been removed from history of sorts because they had turned from being his people to persecuting his people. One might wonder.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Well, and another interesting note on even the use of the word synagogue, it has an ancient use. We can date it back to Pythagoras, actually, because it was used in reference to his places of meeting. They would gather together in a synagogue or a place of meeting. And so it has a long ancient use. Some have suggested that Jews would prefer house of prayer to synagogue, as we see in Philo. And so I don't want to make a lot about the word, but it is interesting to me that there's very little literary or archaeological evidence placing a synagogue in Smyrna. There certainly could have been Jews there, and this seems to give reference to that. And so it makes me wonder if this could have been something other than what we have traditionally thought of as a synagogue, since it's being connected with Satan. Was this some other type of gathering, some other type of assembly, besides what we would commonly associate with the Jews?
Another thing comes to my mind, perhaps a different way of putting this story together or trying to make sense of the story, is it definitely seems that the term or the phrase synagogue of Satan is pejorative. This is not a compliment. And knowing that there was a great deal of syncretism, and there's in that time, and I would say, I don't know that syncretism has diminished in our day at all, but and from that we might get a lesson and say, this is the sort of things that people do. We know that there are those who say they are Jews and are not. There are true Jews, as Paul says, but we now call them Christians. They were first called Christians at Antioch, and they refer to their assemblies as the ecclesia, which is what we commonly translate as church. So I would be more likely to think that this is some sort of progressive group of Jews who are moving away from Judaism, but are perverting the gospel, and that this is some form of syncretism between the Jewish order and the new Christians who have come about. But I think this is now speculation on my part, and we don't know for sure, but we do know the struggle is that it says that there was slander of those who say they are Jews, and I would think that would be true Jews, but they're not true Jews. They're of the synagogue of Satan. And we know that in Galatians and other places, we have those who are known as, remind me of the term, the Galatians, they were the legalists. They were the ones who,
Judaizers.
Yeah, the Judaizers who stuck to the law, but they were also people who would, in a moment, slander the church and get them in trouble with the civil authorities. I'm reminded of what happened in Acts with Simon the sorcerer, who wanted the power and thought he could pay for it, but couldn't get it. So very, very early along in the history of the church, we have these accretions and these syncretistic practices. And this might be just taken to this level, and now it's become an issue again within the church.
And we meet this group twice, don't we? We meet them again in Philadelphia. Jesus makes reference to the synagogue of Satan. He makes one other reference to the seat of Satan. Do you guys see this as the same or something different? And this taking place, the seat of Satan being in Pergamum.
Yeah, I think this is different. I think there are two reasonable ways to interpret this. One is that it was kind of an imperial seat, a strong presence of Roman imperial authority. Another one would be that it was a very strong pagan temple or other such associated place. I currently probably lean towards the Roman, the idea of it being associated with Roman authority, mainly because I would think that if it were referring to something to do with a pagan temple, that Ephesus would actually be the prime location for such a thing, because that was the center of the worship of Artemis of the Ephesians, as we read in Acts. Paul certainly ran into those folks and had quite a bit of trouble with them. They drove him out. But what other evidence is there?
Yeah, Pergamum was the central location of the worship of the god Asclepius. Mm-hmm. And it was very well known that those who would study medicine would actually go to Pergamum to do their study in the temple of Asclepius, or in the school there. And of course, we know that the symbol of Asclepius is the serpent. Yes. And I've wondered if that might be part of the reference here, that the seat of Satan, or Satan's throne, could refer to something connected with the worship of Asclepius. And maybe even making reference to the Genesis account of the serpent.
It certainly could. I mean, the imagery of the serpent, as you noted, has from the beginning brought an imagery of opposition to God. So it very well could be that. When I think of opposition to God, though, you really can't make that point too finely without bringing in Satan. So this isn't just general opposition to the Lord. This would have been a group who truly was going after the church. And as we read in chapter 2, verse 13, you did not deny my faith even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness, who was killed among you where Satan dwells. The wording there just seems to connect the death of Antipas and other saints with that location, with Satan, with Satan's throne.
Yeah. So, I mean, whatever was going on in that city, the Christians were certainly threatened,
Mm-hmm.
as they were in other cities. The reference, even in Smyrna, that they were under threat of imprisonment for their activities. Good. So we're getting some of the interesting cultural things here in Asia Minor, and it's really a fascinating place and a very diverse place too. I might add, we know that in this area there are as many as 50 different ethnic groups that make up the different peoples of Asia Minor. And so you can imagine the vast amount of cultural issues that could come into play in such a diverse area. Again, with Pergamum, Jesus makes mention that of the teaching of Balaam. What do you make of that in chapter 2?
Well, once again, this is an Old Testament story and takes us back to the book of Numbers. And this was a real false prophet, if you know what I mean. This was a prophet, but he was a false prophet, and he would prophesy for money. And the idea behind this and the whole Old Testament story is enforced compromise, especially of a sexual nature. And this ran counter to the command that they were given, that they should never marry into the peoples of the land that they were going to be given. And so here we have this story being taught or referenced. And is this a specific person or a specific group, or is this a metaphor referring back to the Old Testament reference in Numbers?
Again, I would answer yes.
Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things in connecting it back to Numbers is that not only was Balaam a false prophet in the sense that he was kind of out for profit, but by God's grace, he somehow had a connection to God. I mean, when Balak came to him or sent representatives to him wanting him to prophesy against Israel, he went and sought the Lord, and the Lord spoke to him. So in a sense, the character or the idea of Balaam showing up here is somebody who has heard from God and refuses to obey what God is saying, but is constantly out for profit. And he, at least in the person of Balaam in Numbers, he could not violate what God said, but he still would. He ended up telling Balak, "Well, this is how you can ruin Israel. Just send your prettiest daughters out, and that'll work just fine." So this is somebody or a group who know the truth and refuse to bring themselves under the authority of the truth, or they're using the truth for profit in some way, shape, or form.
Hmm. Well, and Don made reference to this earlier, that we do see forms of syncretism even in the churches, in the early church. And here is one of those, that there are people inside the church that are doing these things. And they probably think that this is a part of the way in which they express their worship in some way. And so it's a stark warning that Jesus is giving to the church to be different. The church is not like this. The church is different than what's described in terms of sacrificing food to idols and practicing sexual immorality.
Absolutely.
And it seems clear that the Old Testament situation in Numbers and the situation in the church in Pergamum are analogous. That is, the same type of thing that was happening in Numbers is happening in Pergamum. And this gets to the question of syncretism and accommodation, and the need for the church to respond to this threat in a drastic way. In some ways, John is speaking very prophetically in the sense of forthrightly, and he's trying to scare them. He's trying to put the fear of God in them, I would say.
All right, so Pergamum, I wish we knew who Antipas was. I don't know that we have any information on who this dear saint was who lost his life for his faithful witness.
Well, the good news is his name's in the Lamb's Book of Life.
That's right, we will meet him
someday.
Won't we? Okay. So we have a reference to Balaam, and then to the church in Thyatira in chapter 2, verse 18. There's a reference to Jezebel. Again, another Old Testament reference. What do you guys make of that?
Well, this is just another reminder of how marinated in the Old Testament the book of Revelation is. Yet again, another allusion or image that's drawn out to not just communicate, I don't think, to communicate merely someone who's problematic, but who was a particular enemy of God. And in this case, the pagan queen married to Ahab. And, she was one of the greatest enemies of God's people for her time. She wanted to kill Elijah after he had the prophets of Baal put to death. She practiced all sorts of wickedness and sexual immorality in her day. And here the Lord is connecting her back to this sexual immorality. And she must have been a person in the church. She's not just an outsider who has had great sway, but Jesus gave her time to repent and she refused. And so he will throw her onto a sickbed.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of an interesting warning.
Yeah, absolutely. The thought just ran through my head that for many of the pastors who might be listening, to think, boy, if you think your church had problems or has problems, just look at these churches.
That's right.
Boy, those are some issues, aren't they? Sexual immorality, sacrificing food to idols, these false worship practices that have crept into the lives of the believers in these churches. It's just really amazing to see how susceptible we are to deviate from our proper focus.
It's not difficult.
It may have been helpful for me to say this earlier, but each one of these oracles or letters remind us that you really need to know your Bible. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to do some sort of commentary or exposition of these verses when you have to explain every single background and story that goes with it. So, for example, Jezebel, as David gave us a very brief synopsis, to read that story and then to see it crop up here again, there's an obvious connection. And the obvious connection is, once again, with compromise, with syncretism. And maybe we need to even define syncretism. That is the blending of true worship with false worship. And this comes about through accommodation and compromise, so that we are not unfamiliar with it today. In fact, I have been in many, many evangelical churches all across the country, and I don't think we realize how compromised we are, how syncretistic we are. And we've had earlier discussions on evangelicalism and, do I still want to identify with being an evangelical? And because the meaning has become so broad. And then Michael's position, why would we get rid of such a great word that is the heart of the gospel? But here we're faced with a problem. And it is interesting that idolatry is, I can't think of a single reference where idolatry is not coupled with immorality. The two go together. And the distinctive nature of the Christian and the Christ follower and the church is to be purity and integrity. And so we see this stark contrast here.
Yeah, that's a great point. Good. Well, we're looking at the cultural issues in the first century Asia Minor, the issues that the churches were struggling with. They seem to be fairly clear and almost common among the churches in Asia Minor, and perhaps even among the early church in general. And as we move from an understanding of what those cultural issues were, what is it then that you see as the occasion for the book of Revelation? Why is it that John is writing this? Why is it that Jesus is giving this vision to John? What's he trying to get across to the seven churches?
Well, I think that in a sense, reading any one of the letters to the seven churches gives us a snapshot of that, in the sense that I know you're under assault. Remain faithful and you will be overcomers. You will be blessed. You will be rewarded. You just need to hold on, trust in the plan, stick with it. And, I am coming, says the Lord. The church was under a great deal of pressure. And I think irrespective of whether we go with an early dating or a later dating, clearly these seven churches were either in danger of compromise, giving into compromise. They were in danger of doing all the right things, but for not the right reason. They had lost their love. Or they were holding fast. They were hanging on, but they were ready to give up in the sense that they just were so discouraged and beaten down. Each of these churches in their own way needed to be reminded of who they were and whose they were. And that, I've come to really get bothered by this saying. People like to say, oh, you're on the wrong side of history. I think we need to remember that history is his story, is God's story. And more than that, history will come to an end. And then whose side are you on? Are you on the side of the Lord? Who's on the Lord's side? I think, again, another Old Testament allusion. I think of Moses standing against Korah's rebellion, and who's on the Lord's side? And everybody comes over to him, and they put to death. Or no, it's not Korah's rebellion. It was following the golden calf. And those who came over to Moses' side, he said, take your swords and kill all those who gave themselves over to the worship of the false idol. Are we those who are on the Lord's side, or are we compromisers? Are we idolaters? Are we immoral people? Are we people of the world? Because only those who hold to the Lord are going to end up being overcomers.
My answer to your question is different today than it would have been a week or two ago. I do think it is about remaining faithful in times of hardship, harassment, in times of persecution. But I think as I look at what is the cause of that hardship and harassment, what is the cause of that trial and tribulation, I think it comes from two sources. One is internal, which we've spoken a lot about today with the syncretism, the compromise, the accommodation. So that's one threat, but it is the earliest threat that seems to destroy the church. And then the other source of the hardship and harassment is external. And that is the one that I thought was predominant when I came into this study. But now I think either they're very well balanced or I'm slightly leaning to the internal threats as a result of false teaching and accommodation to culture. Cultural drift is so dangerous. And, interestingly, this could argue for your earlier date, Michael. Okay.
Be careful then.
Yeah. So, but you may not own me. But I think that if we could say the big idea of the book, the big idea is that Christian facing internal and external opposition can hold true to the gospel and be faithful to the Christ, even unto death.
That's great. I love that. The internal and the external threats of the church. That just seems so clear, Don. I agree. Those 7 churches were in difficult times. There was all kinds of turmoil that they were confronting. As you mentioned, the threats from the outside. And they were political threats, weren't they? The empire is growing. The worship of emperors is a real thing. The worship in temples, the demands from others to sacrifice to other gods and goddesses was prevalent at this time as well. So the pressure that the church was under to compromise, and individuals were under to compromise, was great. And
even the economics, you're saying this reminds me of, typically people, the working class were members of guilds and things. And it wasn't just like we think of a modern day union. You're talking about a lot of social stuff that goes on outside of the workplace. And so to have converted to Christianity, to now be a Christ follower, you could end up being cast out of the guild. Who's going to buy your wares? How are you going to get your food? You're cut off from friends and family. They turn their backs upon you. So these are very real threats that we don't tend to think about when we read Revelation, but are certainly realistic on the ground challenges that Christians, particularly the Gentile Christians, but even some of the Jewish Christians would have faced.
Good. Well, hey, this has been a great discussion. Let me conclude with just a final thought here. I find it interesting as we look at Revelation 2 and 3 that we don't give more attention to what might be considered Jesus's assessment criteria for the churches, even for the church today. We often look at the epistles for that, and rightly so. A lot we can learn about what a healthy church looks like. But certainly here, from Jesus himself, he's teaching us what a healthy church looks like. And as I look at this, there are 8 things that just strike me that should mark a healthy church. One is given to every church. Absolutely, every church is told the exact same thing. And that is that these are churches that listen to the Holy Spirit. He who has ears, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. A healthy church is marked by listening to the Holy Spirit. Now, I think, too, as we've been talking about, a healthy church is one that confronts false teaching. It nips it in the bud, because we know that this can be cancerous in a church. It can be divisive. It can destroy congregations. And so a healthy church confronts false teaching. A healthy church proclaims God's glory. And we'll talk more and more about this as we get deeper into Revelation. But it is about God's glory and the proclamation of his glory. It stands for the marginalized, those people that have been exploited. And we see the sexual exploitation of women in a couple of the churches in Revelation 2 and 3. And so the church, to be healthy, is one that stands against these. They stand up for the marginalized. They endure hardship over and over again. We see that just the difficult time that the church faced in Revelation 2 and 3. They stand in faith. They go beyond the work of love and faith and service and endurance. And I don't want to say most importantly, but certainly very importantly, the church keeps sound doctrine. That is so fundamental to who we are, and can ensure that we can stay on track as we keep sound doctrine. And so, guys, any final thoughts as we wrap up our discussion about Revelation 2 and 3?
We can hardly imagine how religious the people of this day, of that day and that era were. We don't have the same sense of spirituality, but there was nothing they did that was not connected with spirituality. And David referred to it earlier in commerce, that it was cultural, and their worship, their civil relationships, the family. It was all saturated with spirituality and this sense of analyzing it from the 21st century can become very difficult if we don't keep that in mind, that they were going to worship something. And they could not imagine a single aspect of their life without that spiritual component. And these people, by nature, by practice, by training for centuries, were syncretistic. Mm. And so there's always this lean into syncretism that then is the death knell of the church.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Don, that's a great final word. For us to keep in mind as we keep on pressing forward through the book of Revelation. And we're looking forward to being with you all next week as we jump into Revelation chapter 4 and continue to discover Jesus through this fantastic book.